Thank you. Thank you, Carol. How are we doing this morning? It is still morning, right? It's been a long day with respect to what we've already covered. I actually want to take a moment to thank the organizers, but also the attendees of this meeting. I find that organizers do a good job, meetings are great. Attendees are engaged, meetings are superb. And I love this meeting because what I've seen and already experienced with the attendees interacting with each other and with the speakers. So I'll try to encourage you to interact with me. I'll also try to encourage you to challenge yourself a little bit. We all come to these meetings for different reasons. We start out coming for one reason sometimes and end up being glad we did for a different reason. This meeting, perhaps a lot of you came because you needed the PDUs. You want to keep your certification alive. There's no shame in that. But hopefully what you found as you've attended the sessions is that you're pleasantly surprised with the pleasure of getting your PDUs. And hopefully you've found that you've learned something about cutting edge thinking that perhaps you wouldn't have learned had you not come. Or perhaps you wouldn't have learned even last year when you were satisfying last year's PDUs. And hopefully then you'll walk out feeling good about what you did. Others of you may have come for networking. You thought, you know what, I don't really like my job. I want to find someone who's going to give me a better one. Or perhaps you found, I need to talk to somebody about my problems, and there's a whole room full of people I can find someone to talk to. And that's a wonderful reason to come too. I've found that I can do that here as well. Hopefully you have as well. I actually find when I look back at why I come to meetings, the ones that I remember the most, I actually remember not because I got PDUs from them, not because I networked from them, because they triggered me to think deep thoughts or ask important questions. And so what I'd like to do is to ask you to let your mind go and let yourself think deep thoughts, ask important questions about what it is that you are doing. I know it doesn't always have to be triggered by a slide. Sometimes it could be triggered by random thoughts that come into your mind as you have heard the talk, and that's fine. One of my deepest thoughts came when I was sitting at a conference listening to management theory explained in excruciating detail. And my deep thought was, I am so tired. But it led to a question. And it led to the question, which was so profound to me at the time, was, why? Why is my job so freaking hard? Because let's face it, as project and program managers, we have a tough job. Well, what I'd like to talk to you today is actually a cascade of events that happened as a result of my asking that question. Why is my job so hard? Because what happened was I found myself asking, why is my job so hard? But really asking, why is my job so complex? And what I realized was that my job was hard because I was working on problems that were very, very complex. And that I had to accept that they were complex. Modern world is complex. That wasn't going to change. As Carol mentioned, I worked in the pharmaceutical industry. And the pharmaceutical industry is a very complex environment. We face challenges in our projects and programs of all kinds. We face the normal operational challenges that come with running programs that are years long. We find technical problems, technical complexity, which comes from managing things that have never been done before. We find external complexity or environmental complexity. It comes from working in an environment that you can't control. And we found the normal complexities of managing your stakeholders and managing your organizations. Basically, we needed to address a whole lot of different kinds of complexity. And when we did, what we found was that we were bad at it. Pharmaceutical industry, 5% of programs that are put in place in order to put a chemical, a medicine, on the market as a product, 5% actually make it to market. So 95% of the programs the pharmaceutical industry runs fail. And actually, there's some data that said of the ones that make it to market, only 30% pay back their development costs. So do the math. We're talking about like 2%. And I found myself that are considered completely successful. And I found myself in a position where I had to say, how are we going to improve our ability to manage these things successfully? If we could improve the success of our projects by 1% on the global scale, we will improve productivity by 50%. And when we began to ask those questions, we found ourselves struggling. And we were struggling because we ended up having to ask fundamental questions about the discipline that we work in. So here's one of those fundamental questions. Should modern organizations, should our company in my case, hire project managers who are principally trained in traditional project management, or should we hire project managers who are trained in the technical subject matter of their projects? Now, we've had speakers already this morning weighing in on the subject. I don't know if anyone's asked this group to vote, so I'm going to ask you. Let's vote. How many people think that we should hire project managers who are principally trained in project management? A good number. How many people think we should hire project managers who are principally trained in subject matter expertise? An equally good number, almost equally good number. How many people didn't raise their hands? Waffling there. It doesn't mean that you're not, it depends, a great answer. The question really comes down to a difference in philosophy. And in a sense, it's a difference in philosophy not only of what you believe about project management or program management, it's a difference in philosophy also about what your organizations believe. Because you have expectations, and so does your organizations. Can we have someone want to tell me why? And someone want to stand up on the first point. We should hire project managers who are principally trained in project management. And tell me why you believe that. Do we have a brave soul?
They have the fundamentals that they learn. So to be a subject matter expert you can develop later, you need the foundation like in a good house.
Need a good foundation. You can develop the subject matter expertise later. How about someone who took the other side? Project managers who are trained in technical subject matter.
I guess and answer this because you were talking about your company and you were doing things that were not done before. So this is, you need somebody who is technically in that. But in other applications, you might not need this. So I was answering to your particular question.
So in my particular question, there was a need for a technical subject matter expertise. What we're facing here is the conundrum that exists in many organizations, but that influences everybody in this room, I suspect. Because in this room, there are people who probably mentally, academically, professionally think of themselves as project managers who are technically competent and who don't need to personally have the subject matter expertise. Others who think of themselves as needing the subject matter expertise, and I can learn the elements of project management that I have. In order to answer the question, you really have to get to a deeper question. And the deeper question is, what is the role of a project manager? Because that leads you to the question of what background do you need? And then once you know what background you need, now we can begin to discuss what leadership skills you should have. The leadership skills have to be interpreted within the context of the background of what you need to do. And then ultimately, how should you behave? Now we've heard a lot of talk at this symposium about how we should behave. But what about the earlier questions? What about what background you need? What about what leadership skills do you have? Let's take a case study, and I'll go first to a pharmaceutical case study. A large study is testing whether a drug is effective. It's a critical part of a valuable drug development program. The study and the report are completed as expected. So the clinical trial is done, and the report is delivered as expected. The study does not show effectiveness. So the study must be redesigned and redone, and obviously has a profound effect on the entire rest of the project. The question that we must ask, was the project team successful? Yes? Let's put our hands up again. Vote yes. Was the project team successful? And I see what looks like a majority, but let's look at the others. Who thinks the project team was not successful? We have a few thinking that the project team was not successful. Now let me ask this. Was the project manager successful? Yes? Was the project manager unsuccessful? Okay. What I see is that a number of people said that most people said the project team was successful and the project manager was successful. And frankly, that's a reflection of the people who come to these seminars. If I ask this same question in an organization, many more in a pharmaceutical organization would say, no, the project team was not successful. Some of them might say the project manager was successful, but not the project team. It's an interesting difference because what constitutes project manager success and what constitutes project team success can be viewed as the same thing in some organizations and different things in other organizations. Let's take another case study. This one's an HR project to streamline the performance assessment system of an organization. It requires the development of a software platform. There are specifications defined on how these performance assessments will be gathered and integrated and distributed out. And a platform was developed to specs, and it was launched exactly as planned. Was the project team successful? Yes? No? Then my favorite answer that was on my tests when I was in college, not enough information. Was the project manager successful? Yes? No? Not enough information? Some people still think not enough. Why is it not enough information? Because we don't know what the business objectives are. Now let me tell you, the users hated it. The users hated the system. Was the project, let's try again, was the project team successful? Yes? No. How many people think no? A lot of people now say the project team was not successful. Why? Because the users hated it. It's an interesting dichotomy because what happens as you're thinking about how do we define success, if you're thinking about a pharmaceutical company, you're thinking about, should I be expected as a project manager to know how to design a clinical study? And the answer in most of your minds is absolutely not. I might be responsible for getting the right person to design the clinical study, but I'm not responsible for that. But when it came to the IT question, should I be responsible for designing a system that the users like? Many, many more of you were willing to say, yeah, I can hold myself accountable to that. Because when I told you the users hated it, what I saw in your hand raising is that many of you flipped from saying it was a successful team to it wasn't a successful team. You were holding yourself accountable to this outcome. You were holding, because you expected, I should know better. I should know how to design a project or a program that's able to satisfy users. But you're not holding yourself accountable to I should know how to design a program that's capable of developing a new drug. And the difference in how you define your roles and responsibilities really comes down to what do you expect that you should know? And that is a very complex question in modern organizations because it depends, which is the answer we heard before, it depends on what the modern organization defines your role and your responsibility to be. And that's a complex question. In modern organizations, we've researched this a little bit through my work at the University of Pennsylvania. And what it seems increasingly to point to, the research increasingly points to, that is modern organizations, the role of a project manager is being redefined oftentimes. And it's being redefined to say the role of the professional is to efficiently deliver outputs benefits, and value. And the responsibilities you have will depend on whether your focus is on delivering outputs, or is your focus on delivering benefits, or is it on delivering value? They are very different things. The pharmaceutical example, delivering an output, which was a clinical study report, you said I could be accountable to that. Delivering benefits, which is a fully developed pharmaceutical agent, a fully developed medicine, maybe not so much. IT, developing a system, I could be accountable to that. Letting the users see the benefits and value in it, okay, I'll take that one on. But what happens in our organizations is we're not often clear about which responsibilities we're taking on and which ones we're not. Which ones we expect is kind of up to the gods and which ones are up to us. And that's a problem. But why? What happens when you put yourself in a position to have to deliver outputs, benefits, and value? In order to efficiently deliver benefits and value, your job becomes a job of managing issues. Because benefits and value can't always, the path to achieving benefits and value cannot always be defined as precisely as the path that's required to deliver outputs. So if you're responsible for benefits and value, you have to be ready to manage issues that might emerge over the course of what you're doing. And when you do that, you have to be responsible for managing uncertainty. Because you have to start thinking about, what am I sure is going to work? I can develop an IT system. I can do user testing, and that'll tell me that the users like it. Or what you're uncertain of that you can't handle. Like, I don't know when I give a person a drug if they're going to vomit. Because there are no animal models that tell me whether people will get nauseous from a drug. So you need to actually manage uncertainty. And when that uncertainty rears its head, usually resolving it in modern organizations requires that you manage complexity. Because oftentimes the problems that we face are complex problems. And that's why you're so tired. That's why projects fail. Many projects fail. That's why you need to step back and think about the bigger questions sometimes. In fact, if I look at this flow of logic, I would say that the role of a modern project management needs to focus on delivering outputs, benefits, and value, managing the consequences of uncertainty, and resolving complexity. It's actually quite a different credo than the one we all grew up living with, which is that iron triangle of our job is to deliver on time, on budget, and on specifications. I got to pause. Does anybody have a tattoo that says that? I'm convinced out there is somebody who got that tattoo. Right? So many people get tattoos. Really, if you have that tattoo, don't worry, there's still a role. But the reality is you need a bigger tattoo. Because in fact, in modern organizations, what's happening is more and more project managers are being asked to manage what's uncertain. That could be operations, budget, timeline, and specifications. But it also could be outcomes. It also could be benefits. And when you want to manage the uncertain, what you need to do is you need to position yourself to solve what's complex in order to deliver the value. And what you need to know to solve what's complex depends on what the project is. So your roles, your responsibilities will depend on what the project is. If you go back to the case studies, what you realize is that what each case study produced was both outputs and outcomes. The output of the pharmaceutical case study was a very high quality study report. The outcome was what the report said. Now, many project managers could tell you, I'm perfectly capable of promising to deliver on time, on budget, and on specification a study report. I can't guarantee you what it's going to say, because that depends on what happens when we do the work. Right? Same thing with the IT. I can promise you to develop a functional IT system. But the user experience in using that system, I'm a little less certain about. Not as uncertain as with the pharmaceutical agent, but a little less uncertain about. And when you realize that a lot of what we do depends on both outputs and outcomes in modern world, what you realize is that we're facing two different kinds of complexity. Our projects are facing complexity that's related to operations and complexity that's related to outcomes. And the question becomes, can both kinds of complexity be managed by the same project manager? It's an interesting question because it gets down to the fundamentals of what skills do you need for project management. If you look at operational complexity, the complexity about executing your projects as planned, you realize that managing operations requires typical project management skills. Okay? You can study those. They're in the PMBOK. It's darn good at teaching you operational skills. Okay, you might not use every step in the PMBOK for your projects, but every step you might need is probably in there. Okay? But managing outcomes sometimes requires technical skills and technical and subject matter knowledge. And what's more important becomes what's more important to the success of your project. But the reality is, complex problems rely on both. In order to execute them well, you have to be able to execute operationally. You won't hit your goals if you don't. But in order to deliver the value, you might also have to manage the operations and the outcomes. And the challenge here is, and the reason that we're so torn and conflicted by this question of should you have technical skills or should you have operational skills, the real challenge to that oftentimes is based in some simple observation. And the observation is they require different leadership styles. Very often the base foundation for managing operations is a command and control kind of a mindset. Let's face it, we project time, we project budget, we project specifications, and then we spend our entire project trying to prove we were right. Right? But, so you need to control to your projections. But managing outcomes requires that you kind of let go of the ability to control and you embrace the fact that I have no idea what's going to happen. And I need to learn from what I do and then adapt. So I can't project beyond perhaps the next milestone. I just need to project what the next milestone will be, and then I'll decide what the next milestone will be. It's a very different mindset. And the question is, what do you need to be in order to achieve that mindset? I actually think to do the operations, I try to think of what would I like in the perfect project manager to manage the operational side. And I think I want a savant. I want somebody who can sit there at the table, Dustin Hoffman style, Rain Man, sit there at the table and just know what the answers are to operational questions. I need someone who's really going to, mind works that way and pulls it all together. But what about outcomes? I need someone with a crystal ball. I need like a sage. I need someone who really is able to look into that crystal ball and predict what's going to work, what's not going to work. What can I do to maximize the chances it's going to work? It's going to produce the outcomes that I want. And the reality is, finding that in one person can be very hard. It's a rare creature. Think of a rare creature. What do you think of? Call it out. Unicorn. First, what's that? Duck-billed platypus. Maybe that's what a project manager needs to be, a duck-billed platypus. I heard unicorn first. Yeah. Everybody thinks of a unicorn, and that's actually what I thought of when I thought of this. But then, as I tried to think about it and describe what I wanted my project managers to be, as I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, the unicorn didn't quite strike it. I'm sorry. It just, these were people who were well seasoned. They actually preferred to think of themselves as centaurs. Okay? And why a centaur? I think, okay, so it's a little bit less fanciful. But they thought of themselves as centaurs because they thought of themselves as being a combination of the kind of person who could think strategically, have a plan, execute well. That's the man part, or the woman part. And also someone who could blaze forward with the strength and speed of a horse. So what we really need for complex projects is centaurs. Now, how many people here are centaurs? Ah, we have a brave soul. A couple of brave souls. Are you a centaur? That's the question that I would ask you to ask yourself when you're thinking about your roles and your responsibilities and the ways that you want to grow. Because the question can become, if you are going to lead a complex project, how do you become a centaur if you're solely responsible for it? And if you're not able to become a centaur or don't want to be, because a lot of project managers will say, I don't want to be. I can tell you in the pharmaceutical industry, they go, if I have to go to medical school, forget it. A lot of them don't want to be centaurs, but if you're not, you better find a way to access those centaurs, because you have to manage both sides, and you have to develop the competency to understand how to manage both sides. Now, we had a session on emotional intelligence. As I sat there in the session and let my brain free associate, what I found myself realizing is that a lot of the skills of emotional intelligence are skills that enable us to become that savant or that sage. At the end of the day, whether you choose to become both really depends on a lot of other things. And it depends on how you define what your professional goals are. It also depends on how your organization defines whether you are expected to have both roles and responsibilities. The question becomes, who fills these roles in modern organizations? And this is what I struggled with as in the pharmaceutical industry, was saying, should I hire technical people or should I hire project management professionals? And it comes down to this. If we started to explore this with people who worked in various industries. And we began by asking my students at Penn, who were mid-career executives looking for a master's degree in organizational dynamics, but project program portfolio management. And I asked them, tell me about your governance system in your organization and how responsibilities are defined. And basically what those people said was, we basically have two major parties at the table. There's the governance party, and then there's the project management party. And when we look at those two parties, we could actually say, tell me what the responsibilities of governance would be. And this is the list they came up with. Well, they define the organization's strategic direction, or maybe they endorse it. They authorize the projects. They enable the projects to do their work. They endorse the strategies of the projects. They approve resource allocations. They delegate responsibility. They integrate learning, and they authorize change. And I say, okay, so what does project management do? Well, they manage the team. They oversee the completion of work, and they assure efficiency, collaboration, communication. Now, let me ask you, is this the fundamental system that your organizations use? Raise your hand if the answer is yes. Some. Those who have not answered yes, why? Do you have a very different system? Are there people in your organization who think this is your system? In most cases, the answer is yes. The problem is that this system actually is a really difficult system when your projects get complex. And it's difficult because it requires, in order for the system to work, the governing committee needs to understand every project. And because they can't keep it all in their heads, they need to be reminded of every project before a decision needs to be made. And your job turns into a job of creating background documents and presentations and meetings and pre-meetings and pre-meetings and informing your team member to inform their manager so that that manager can inform their executive. Because what happens is the governing committee can't do everything on that list when projects get really complex or when organizations get big. They can't keep up with it, and they won't admit it. Let's face it. Why would they? They want to be in control. They want to pretend they are, but this is what happens. And when organizations, when committee members manage large groups or sponsor a lot of initiatives or sponsor complex initiatives, or when they're not subject matter experts themselves, they need to be spoon-fed all the information so that they can make the right decision. And now your success is defined at whether you gave them the right information and influenced them in just the right way that the decision was made right. That's a tough job. No wonder we're tired. So what do organizations do when they start struggling with this? Well, we know what they do, and this is the reason that most people didn't raise their hand. What they do is they start inventing parts of the system to help them. So if they have large functional groups, they start with putting in review committees to help them review stuff. And that might be an operational review committee. It may be a discipline review committee. It may be a technology review committee. They start with large portfolios, having portfolio prioritization committees and resource management committees and customer focus committees and partner-based committees. And for complex subjects, they have technical committees and they have externally focused committees to understand how the customers are going to react. They end up with committees. And so what happens is your system that starts like this, and those who raised their hands said, that's fundamentally how we work. In reality, looks like this. Okay, and when it looks like that, what happens is you have review committees and business committees and mixed function review committees and sub-projects and sub-programs and other activities and work streams. When all of these things start behaving as independent entities, you got a mess. And guess what? Your job is to deliver the value, so you've got to manage it. Okay, because what you're judged on is, did you do what you were supposed to do? And if you need to depend on all these committees to do what you need to do, that's your job. That's what it looks like. Are we still wondering why we're so tired? I haven't put the arrows here. Remember, these are all the arrows showing how a project or program interacts with its committees. I haven't put the arrows on here showing how the committees interact with each other. You think you got everything straightened out with one committee, go to the next committee and they make a different decision or recommendation, where do you go? Back to the first committee. It's a mess. So now let me ask you, who's responsible for managing the mess? And what happens is, the answer is, well, it depends. What does it depend on? Well, if we step back and think about the conundrum we face, modern organizations need to solve very complex problems, and they could be operational problems, or they can be outcome problems. And when they do, they need help. And their help is to build systems that help them manage problems. They actually create complex organizations. So as if your job wasn't tough enough, managing operational complexity and outcome complexity, now you have to manage organizational complexity. The complexity of a very difficult organization. Okay? And you have to have different skills in order to do that. Emotional intelligence being a critical factor in your ability to maintain that balance. It's interesting to see what happens when you take organizations and you say, let's figure this out. So you have all those committees. Let's kind of put them in buckets. And so what we did with that the organization that was shown in that last messy slide, we said, let's characterize your committees. And this was a pharmaceutical industry. And the committees we characterized, we called these extra committees secondary governance and review committees. And we said, characterize them. So let's ask alliance management, portfolio review, line function, therapy area, technology review. Let's ask, what role does each committee play? Because we're trying to understand what things does each committee influence. And so we asked them, let's define whether that committee's responsibility is to enable the team to do work, like a governance kind of role. Is it to manage operations, to help you do your operational piece of your work? Or is it to help you manage the outcomes? And so we asked the organization, define the roles of each of these committees with an understanding of trying to understand how can we better manage the interactions of all these committees. And what do you think we found? Anyone want to venture a guess? Redundancy. Anything else? Decision-making confusion. Confusion over what the roles of the committees were and what the responsibilities of the committees were. So what we ended up with is when we asked them to assess whether the roles were oversight, outcome management, or operation management, we found that there wasn't a single committee that only had one role. And then each committee had a different blend of roles, but none of them had only one role. And we found ourselves asking, now whose job is it to sort out things like the operational complexity, which seemed to have been meddled with by every single committee, or the operations, which seemed to have been meddled with by every single committee. And what we found was that you could map it. If you go back to what you presume is your model, oftentimes, what you found is that the governance piece, it kind of assumed that the governance committee of a project would somehow integrate all the governance perspectives of all these committees. And in most organizations, regardless of their industry, the governance committee seemed to have assumed that role. Well, it makes sense because a lot of times it was the governance committee members who spawned the committees. Sometimes they were the chairmen of the committees, chairwomen of the committees. So who was responsible for operations? Well, who was the operational savant expected to integrate all the perspectives and come out with a unified plan, a unified perspective on this plan? Typically, wouldn't you guess? Project management. The problem in organizations running complex initiatives is that they couldn't uniformly agree on who was responsible for managing outcomes. So who was responsible for managing benefits? Some organizations would clearly define it's the program and project management. Those were organizations who were running things like the IT system, where they expected the project manager would have the knowledge to do that. And in a sense, in that organization, the project manager was an outcome sage and an operational savant. It was a centaur, could do both. But in other organizations, we're reserving that responsibility for governance. Governance manages outcomes, and governance needs to make the decisions about strategic adaptation. Project management just does operations. Well, those organizations ended up facing problems because, as we said, as they get bigger, governance can't handle it, and they don't want to admit it. The question was, who is responsible for managing outcomes? So let me ask a question. In this room, how many people here are the ones responsible for managing the outcomes in your endeavors? A good number. Ralph. Ralph manages outcomes. Congratulations, Ralph. You have a clearly defined role. There's Ralph. Does it look like you? I don't think so. But, well, it's like hair color, kind of, sort of. In organizations, what happens is they find people they trust, like Ralph. And they say, you know, Ralph, you understand project management, and you're a little bit on the ball with outcomes. We're going to give you the outcome piece. And so they'll say, yeah, Ralph handles, we entrust Ralph with the outcomes. But that same organization might not have another Ralph. So the next project team may not have someone clearly defined. And what you end up with is this disparate, unorganized way that organizations manage their outcomes because they trust Ralph. So on that team, they'll let Ralph do it. But on the team manager who's next door to Ralph, they say, no, you're not as good as Ralph. For you, the governance committee's got to do it. And what we end up with is these systems that don't clearly define who's responsible for what. And there's the challenge in complex projects, because you can't find enough centaurs like Ralph. Congratulations, Ralph. The question is, where is Ralph? Who should serve the outcome sage role? Integrating the knowledge and perspective on the outcomes, recommending adaptations to strategy based on emerging outcomes. Well, if you stop and think about where we've come as a discipline, you can actually consider that we have two generations of project management. The first generation is the traditional project management. generation, where it was born in engineering and construction industry, a linear kind of project management, on time, on budget, on scope. And then we've recognized that there's a need for something different. And we've invented all sorts of kinds of ways to do project management. We had adaptive project management, which was kind of superseded or replaced by agile project management. We have lean project management. Now we have agile lean project management. We had complex project management, which was kind of dealing with the ambiguity of managing complex things. And then we've even had extreme project management, which is project management when you have no clue what your project's supposed to do in any case. You just say, hey, let's explore something, okay? But all of these these new project managements, if you take a step back and think about it in the context of what we just talked about, all of these project management skills are basically variations of project management that define if you're responsible for outcomes or not. In the first generation, you're expected to manage operations. If you are in the second generation, you have been partially identified as the outcome sage. An agile project manager manages activities or defines what activities need to be done, gathers the team back together, assesses the outcomes, and then makes decisions about what to do next. Agile project management is built around the concept that project managers need to be an outcome sage and separate the project into steps where we can be agile in adapting. The problem with agile project management, it has very specific applications. It doesn't work in the pharmaceutical industry. Pharmaceutical industry timelines are 10 years long. You go away to do something, you might not come back with the results for 18 months. It's not like you can have weekly stand-up meetings. So what happens is second generation systems work, but they work because what they've done is they've clearly defined how to be adaptive in the context of managing a project. But they don't work for everything. So the question becomes, is there a more universal approach? And this is the deep thinking that I actually landed on as a consequence of sitting in a meeting like this and saying, I am so tired. So let me point to you how the logic of this works. Sometimes there's a need for two kinds of project management professional, the outcome sage and the operational savant. The traditional one, the operational savant, focuses on the traditional operations. But the second role needs to be outcome related or technical leadership related. It needs to actually have a hand in that learn and adapt style of leadership. What we need is to formally define how we're going to grow or hire people like Ralph. You're going to be very popular when this is over. So how do you grow and hire that within an organization? Because what organizations need when they're really doing complex things is someone who not only can integrate all those operations, but someone who can integrate all that strategy. Now, different organizations have found different ways to solve this. If you poured into your PMBOK and said, let me find the role that was supposed to do that, because it must be in there somewhere, you'd end up with probably pointing at project sponsor. That's the Ralph. Because I don't know where else it would be. It might be the project manager, but it depends on how much technical knowledge is known. The question then becomes, how do you grow that person? And if you put that person on a team with a project manager, how do they work together? You end up realizing that what you have is a system. And we heard, for those who attended the workshop yesterday, the system was, the point that was made was that there is a system, that teams work as parts of systems. And what does a system look like? A system looks like this. If you put the outcome sage in, what you end up with is the governance committee authorizes a project, an event. And you're pursuing benefits or goals, outcomes. In order to pursue those goals, you conduct activities. They are managed operationally by the project manager. Those activities result in outcomes. And if the outcomes are as predicted, no adaptation is required, you conduct more activities according to your plan. There's a synergistic kind of interaction between these two roles. And then once we've had a synergistic interaction between these two roles, when an outcome indicates that the strategy needs to be adapted, the adaptation recommendation goes back to the governance committee. So you can actually define this role as a separate role from project management, but completely dependent with project management in terms of the project management as we had previously defined. And it actually creates a system whereby you have what's called a shared leadership system. What happens is you have that system, and the governance committee here is really a team. We're interacting with a team that is a governance system. And you're doing that by virtue of having a team, which has someone in an operational savant role and also someone in an outcome sage role. These two people, these two project management professionals, are focused on operations and strategy. And then what you end up doing is, through the dynamics of teams, you assemble and integrate outcome-based work, operational work, and make recommendations jointly to the governance committee, who then digest it as a team. What you've done is you've created, in an organization where the governance committee existed as a team, and the project team existed as a team, but they are separate teams, you've created points of contact to form an internal team that crosses both boundaries. And the internal team is focused on managing operations, managing outcomes, and managing the organizational stuff that enables it all to happen. And so by defining this role, you've defined a team that bridges the governance and the operational challenges. Now, what happens is they become what I call a centaur of excellence. They're joined at the hip. This person who's adaptive and this person who's operational become joined at the hip and can actually manage very complex projects. But who is that outcome-focused answer, that outcome-focused person? So we may already know the answer. So let's go through this slide and tell me what the answer is. Is it a project or is it a program? Cleaning the basement is my latest project. Planting a garden is the springtime. Losing weight, I have to go on a weight loss. Getting an education is an educational. Building a shed, a home improvement. Breaking a drug habit, rehabilitation. Doing an assignment, or improving in sports is an athletic. Doing an assignment, finishing an art. Defending our country is our defense. You're saying all the same things. Okay? You know the difference. We get caught up in what's the difference between a project and a program. You know what the difference between a project and program is. So why do we call some of these things projects and some of these things programs? If you look and keep asking why, what you find is that everything that you call a program depends on a path that requires learning and adaptation. And everything you call a project presumes that the path is knowable and executable. Okay, pick one out. Getting an education is an educational program because when you take courses, it influences what courses you will take next. When you have a defense program, when you do something, it influences what your enemy does, and therefore that influences what you will do next. Everything that we call a program is outcome-based. It depends and needs a learning component. So who is that third person? The third person is actually, I think, secretly what we call a program manager. So my perspective here is, and the challenging thing I'll give you, is that project management actually is a profession that focuses on design and completion of plans to ensure on time, on budget, and to specifications. So if you have your tattoo, keep it, even if you won't admit you have it. Okay? But program management is a profession that ensures the optimum delivery of benefits by adaptively managing program strategies. And when you look at Agile, what they're doing is they're taking project managers and conferring on them the responsibilities of program managers. And what we need, I think, to do is to rethink how we brand ourselves. project managers are operational savants. We can't live without them. It doesn't always require that they understand outcomes. They need to be conversant in it. They need to be credible in it if you attended the session in this room before. But they don't need to be expert in it. Program managers may need to be expert in it. It depends. Now, what does the system look like? Three-part system. Now here's he told me that he was daydreaming in a management-intensive seminar, and that's what stimulated all this. I should have known that he was going to go this way. The reality is, if you have a three-part system, it actually enables you, three-party system where you have program management separately defined, it actually enables you to use a two-party system in your organization. What happens is you can, within your organizations, define a separate program management function that kicks in when you need to manage benefits. But when you don't need a separate person to manage benefits, the two-party system exists within the three-party system. So if you've got Ralph, you can use a two-party system. But for the projects where you don't have enough Ralphs, you might decide, I'm going to name someone who is outcome-focused to fill it, and I'm going to manage that one with a three-party system. So it enables organizations to flexibly define what project management role is by more clearly being able to state it. And the idea is that when you do this, you can start to recognize that programs are two-party systems, where a program as traditionally defined that manages a lot of projects, the program assumes the role of the governance system. It's another two-party system. And actually, three-party systems can exist within three-party systems if you have sub-programs within programs. I won't go into more detail on this. You've had enough detail. But I'll just point out that that is in the book that Carol mentioned. So what are the benefits? Well, one of the benefits is it formalizes the expectation of an outcome SAGE role and eliminates leadership ambiguity. It increases empowerment because you can clearly define your success is defined by your ability to manage operations, whereas another person's is based on its ability to manage outcomes. And in the end, it fosters more autonomous teams. It enables a deeper examination of leadership behaviors. The question is, how do we manage leadership behaviors? So let me spend my last couple of minutes talking about leadership behaviors, because I find it fascinating. Because once you get into this, understanding I need an outcome SAGE, I understand I need a operational savant, you find yourself saying, how should I behave as one of those? So take a scenario. Your job description says you proactively facilitate issue resolution. It's probably on every one of your job descriptions. But what does proactive mean? You can begin to tease out exactly what does it take to be an outcome SAGE, or what does it take to be a operational savant. An executive meets a project leader or manager in the hall. Says, I hear you're having a problem, and the project manager says, yeah, I am. He says, well, here's what I think you should do. What does the project manager do? So the executive has told the project manager, this is what I want you to do. Well, one is, there are actually 5 responses the project manager can take to this. If you think about it, actually, there are only 5 responses a project manager could take to this. One response is to say, okay, I'm not the subject matter expert, I'll tell them though. The second response is, I'm not the subject matter expert, but I'll call a meeting, I'll facilitate a meeting between you and her. The third is, I'm not the subject matter expert, but here's what I think the subject matter expert would say if he was here or she was here. The fourth is, I'm not the subject matter expert, but here's what I think they would say, and here's what I think we should do. The fifth is, I'm not the subject matter expert, but here's what I think they would say, and here's what I think my team members would say, and here's what I think. Let's talk about how we can align all these positions. You see, in every case, you could argue that these responses are proactive. They facilitate issue resolution. But not every case has the same expectations. If I asked you, what does a savant, an operational savant, do? Someone who integrates all that complexity, what levels of behavior do they have to have? you start finding that when you think about them in terms of the savant role, you start finding that they need to anticipate what other people think. And they need to be able to express it themselves. They need to be able to function at this higher level. That being at the lower level is not enough to be the savant or the sage. Okay? So what you find is that all responses are acceptable, but some are more acceptable. And you can actually take this test to an organization. And when you go to an organization's executive committee and say, what do you think they should do? What do you think you find? They're all over the place. If I take a managing committee that's been together for 10 years and ask them what should the manager do, there are some people who say, number 1 is the only acceptable solution. They shouldn't speak for others. Number 1 and 2. Others say, 1 and 2 is not proactive. You got to be at 4 or 5. And they're all giving their project managers different advice. You stand up in front of the meeting, and depending on who's awake, you get beat up. Because no matter what you do, there's someone who disagrees. And what we need to do is to define what do we need to do as a profession. Because in fact, what you can do if you work with organizations is you can get them to define what is an acceptable range of behavior, below which is not enough, and above which is too much. And then you can define what happens what is the typical behavior that we see in our organization? And what is what we really prefer if people only knew to act that way? And ideally, what is it that we want to work towards? And then what you can do is you can take your project managers and leaders and say, assess yourself. Where are you? And you can say, aha, you are at a level that's considered to be not enough. You prefer to be at a level that's higher. Good news. Your manager wants you to be there too. Be that savant, step into that role. Immediately, they're already ready for it. And guess what? You want to go this high, your managers are telling you should go higher. You can actually begin, when you define your roles that way, to segregate out which behaviors are necessary, which behaviors a savant should have or a sage should have. We are actually doing research on this right now. I'm about to release a survey to tie behaviors like this to your success. And so if anyone would like to participate in this survey, we're going to validate this as an instrument for assessing how behaviors correlate with success in either the operational savant or outcome sage role. So if you're interested in participating in the survey, I ask you to leave your business card here. I'll send you an email with a survey link probably in about a month. So that's where we are. The key messages are that it's a principal responsibility of modern project managers to manage complex issues. We need to more clearly define how we're going to do that. This is focused on the nuts and bolts of project management. A little less on the soft skills, a little more on really what is it you're supposed to do, not just how you're supposed to do it. We should accept that the skills for managing complexity are different and take control of how we define our roles. If we take control of how we define our roles, we have a much better chance of being successful in them and ultimately becoming better leaders. At the end of the day, I think we need to prove to the world that we are actually scientists in a sense, not hard science, but maybe social science, where we deal with, the science of how best to manage projects. And that's the challenge I would leave with you all. I do know that we're close to our lunchtime, and so I wanted to end there. I will just say that some of the concepts that I presented today are described in a book, Managing Complex Projects and Programs. I have a limited number of copies that will be available out in the sponsor room, but it is also available on Amazon. So I want to thank you. I don't think we have time for questions. Are we that tight?
I'm going to say thank you very much on behalf of PMI New Jersey to Rick coming here today. If you have questions, Rick will stay behind a few minutes to answer them. You do not have to rush out to the buffet. There is plenty of food and plenty of seats for you. So please take the time to network. And I thank Rick for presenting this complex project.